What I'm going to visit with you about today is drinking from your garden. So what brainstorming with some other agents and how to do collaborative programming, we found that there was a lot of interest in infused waters. And we started brainstorming and said, herbal teas are part of that as well. I'm not going to go in as much about growing herbs because I love to talk about that, and that is a whole nother presentation in and of itself. And if you have a question in particular, we can answer that at the end. Now, I will say that based off of my experiences, I tried to focus on herbs that I knew we could grow in our area. And really kind of the three that I find grow really well and easily for the novice gardener are mint, basil, and if you choose the right lavender. Now that is you have to choose the right one. A lot of them you'll be disappointed in. So that's what our flavor profiles are going to focus on. And normally if we had the freedom to do this in person, I would start with a demonstration making an herbal tea. And one of the main reasons I would start our presentation doing that is because you want to give your herbal teas plenty of time for the flavors to steep and cool down. So if we were doing this in person and I was able to give you samples, we would start with an herbal tea demonstration. That way we could taste it afterwards. But instead, I'm just going to kind of jump into the presentation itself. And we're going to start with infused waters and going through the different tips and how you can get the best out of your infused waters. Because looking into it, my preliminary research, there's a lot of information out there about it. So I wanted to bring everything together so that I could give you a good general how-to to get started. And the number one thing that I wish more publications would focus on is that you want to cut your fruits in a way that increase surface area. That's how it's going to diffuse that flavor, because fruits are naturally self-enclosed packages. Makes it nice for us to ship and store, but not for releasing flavor. So you're going to want to cut them in ways where they're going to actually diffuse flavor into it. And with strawberries, you can see here and a little bit more in details. And for large berries, for increasing that surface area, you're going to want to do more than just cutting them in half. That's better than putting in whole strawberries, which I've seen people do. And whole strawberries will release a little bit of flavor, but it won't be strong. Cutting them in half is going to increase your flavor distribution, but cutting in very thin slices is going to give you the best distribution of flavor. It's going to release more in that way. And that same principle with blueberries. If you put in whole blueberries, they're not going to release much. And there's several strategies you can do for small berries and blueberries. You can kind of crush them a little bit. I find it's almost more effective to slice them. That is very time intensive though, so it may not be the best option for everyone. But slicing them in half is going to release a lot more flavor than if you just try to throw them in there whole. To be honest, if you put them in there whole without any way to pierce that skin, they're not going to contribute much flavor at all. You get a little bit more if you take like a toothpick and pierce them, but even then, that releases a little bit of flavor, not a lot. You just release a lot more if you cut it in half, like shown here. Now, here's another thing to consider. For infused waters, we're not aiming to make a sugary beverage. And because of that, you can use tart berries more readily because you'll still get the flavor of the aromatic compounds and the acidic compounds, and they'll be diluted over the water. So like a cranberry, not a pleasant eating experience in and of itself. But if you take a cranberry, slice it, and use it in infused water, that tartness is diluted and you still get kind of the flavor of the cranberry, and you can pair it with like a citrus and still get a lot out of that tart compound. If you want to add some sugar to it in a way, I think one of the best ways to do it is actually to freeze fruit juice in ice cubes, and it kind of makes it real fancy, and it slowly adds it, and you can get a lot of use to it. You can also do this with other more powerful herbs and it'll release a little bit as it melts through. It just kind of makes it that tad bit more fancy. Wouldn't do it probably for my everyday consumption just because it's a lot of extra effort to make that. But if you wanted to have it for a special occasion, I think it really dresses it up. Now, here's something to really consider at times. Frozen berries could be used as ice cubes, and you can use them for making the diffused waters. Now, we'll tell you there's several things to consider with using frozen fruit for this purpose. One, frozen fruit is not going to be as sweet as fresh fruit. Generally, it's different cultivars grown for the different things, and your processed blueberries and strawberries tend to be a bit more tart. So, but again, we're not doing this for that. And also, you're going to release what sugars are there, you're going to release more of. The issue gets to be when you have frozen, you completely destroy cell walls, cell membranes. So essentially, when they thaw out, they're going to be leaky. And that's good for our situation because that means they're going to leak more of their flavor compounds, aromatic compounds into that water. Now, the only thing to consider is for a food safety issue, I would go ahead and I would not let it sit there in the system. I would go ahead and remove your fruit out of it quicker than I would another system. I will say, because it releases so much more powerful. In fact, I gave this presentation yesterday in person, was able to do a taste test using from a frozen situation of recipe we have later in here of strawberry, blueberry, basil. The strawberry releases so much more flavor when it's frozen that you may not have the same combos. When you use fresh, you have more mellow combos. When you use frozen, it's very intense flavor distribution. So it may be for using from frozen, you want to focus maybe just on strawberries and not try to have the same mellow flavor combinations as if you're using fresh fruit. Now, using citrus, I really like using it in herbal teas and infused waters. Infused waters, you want to be careful. There are some compounds that turn bitter over time in your rind, and if you let them sit too much, they'll start adding bitterness instead of the nice, refreshing citrus flavor. So you either want to use them in small amounts, or you want to make certain you remove them so that after about 24 hours in an infused water situation, so that you still get the nice, fresh citrus taste, but not the bitterness. Another way you can get around it is to take the peel off of the citrus, but I think I would experiment with it. You really do get nice, refreshing citrus flavor from the rind, but like I say, be careful. It can contribute bitterness if you leave it in there too long. Now, I want to take a minute to look at the nutrition information on infused waters. Literature review, this is one of the things I had the hardest time finding, and I just want to share some information with you. Ultimately, when you make most of the recipes you're going to find at the recommended ratios, there's very little nutritional value. Ultimately, most recipes follow a 1:4 to a 1:8 ratio of fruit to water. You're going to get more flavorful combinations if you use a 1:3, but in most cases, the nutritional value spread across the water is going to be fairly minimal. Ultimately, your main nutritional benefit you're going to get is from just increased water uptake and staying hydrated in that regard. If what you're making is very sweet to the taste, more than likely you've added way too much fruit. And at that point, it'd still be an infused water, but it's not how most of the literature recommends making it. And that would be really, essentially, if you have your pitcher jam-packed with fruit and just a little bit of water going through there, yes, it's going to be much sweeter, and then you're losing kind of At that point, you're increasing sugar consumption to the point where it's almost, it would probably be better than fruit juice, but just marginally better. Now, and here's the deal. You do have, in these situations, sugars and nutrients are moving into the water, but it's much less than if you were to eat this fruit itself. So a lot of your compositions, it's hard to find out how much sugar you are getting, because I will tell you from that, most of the recipes I found when I started doing some digging, the way they calculated the nutritional value is they figured out how much sugar, how much everything you're getting from the fruit itself, and then divided it across the water. Now, if you were to sit there and drink your whole pitcher and eat the fruit in there, that would be accurate. Most of the cases, the fruit's going to be thrown out. So really, most of what you find out there on the internet literature, if you make it according to that recipe, more than likely your nutritional information is going to be much less, which is good for our purposes because a lot of people looking into this are wanting to do it as a healthy alternative. So it'll be pretty much like consuming water unless for some reason you use a heavy hand on your fruit that you're adding into this. I do want to take some time to look into food safety issues. Even though there isn't a lot of sugars going through, there's enough where that we want to be considerate and just be very cautious from a food safety standpoint. And the number one is don't start with bruised or damaged produce. Your injured produce has the potential to introduce bacteria and fungi into the system. And even though there's not a lot of free-floating sugars into the system, there are free-floating sugars for fungi and bacteria to make use of. So just don't use damaged fruit, especially ones that already have an issue. In a lot of cases, for sustainability, I might encourage you to cut out a damaged portion and still try to consume it, but I wouldn't use it for my infused waters just to be safe. Now, and here's another thing. Before making your infused water, yes, go ahead and rinse and wash your produce before cutting them. But I wouldn't say rinse and wash produce and then put it in the refrigerator for long-term storage, because that actually increases spoilage and microbial growth. That rinsing and washing prior to consumption, you're washing what is there on the surface, and you don't want, but you're spreading stuff around. Generally, it's at such a low rate that it's not an issue if you consume it immediately. But if you put it back into a refrigerator or back into storage, there's an opportunity that whatever you gave, whatever was on the surface, water to spread. So you don't want to wash before storage, wash before consumption. You want to use cool and cold water. Generally, water below 41 degrees greatly reduces your microbial growth. In a lot of situations, use ice very freely, and that will make it much safer from a food standpoint. It will slow diffusion because diffusion does increase at higher temperatures, but a lot of times, ultimately, my recommendation for infused waters is going to be, if you make them, I would put it in my refrigerator overnight. So you want to make these plan in advance. So that's going to be safe temperature for diffusion and have plenty of time for that. I will say, if you leave your fruit in your infusion, your shelf life is greatly reduced. You can see that you get constant diffusion there, but you are leaving a surface for inoculum for bacterial fungi to grow on. You're going to get much longer storage if you take the fruit out. It can be a little bit more difficult in pitchers like this. Ultimately, if you're leaving your fruit in, though, I would say if you take your fruit out, you probably have a good 4 days that you can use this. If you leave your fruit in, I wouldn't use it longer than 2 days. I also would not, unless you're using very rapid consumption, would not top it back off. If you are, for some reason, if you slice fruit and you leave it sit overnight and then you drink it all in a very short 1 day period, you might get one more infusion out of it. But that's not, most people are not going to consume that quickly. You will find that the second infusion is going to be less flavorful, but go ahead and you can attempt it in a short period, but not on, say, if it's been in the refrigerator 2 days, throw it out from a food safety standpoint. Infused water should only sit at room temperature for 4 hours max. If you let it sit out in a vent that long, I would go ahead and dispose of it instead of trying to salvage it and put it back in the refrigerator. Now, that is standard room temperature. In Louisiana in the summer, we don't have standard room temperature. If you're going to have it outside for an event, I would say any small amount you're going to want to, like say you even just have it out 30 minutes, you're going to want to have it put up. I mean disposed of afterwards. Herbal teas. So there's a little bit more that goes into that. There's a little bit more combinations you can play around with, and just some stuff, jumping into some tips with this. Fresh herbs are not as strong as dried ones. Personally, I like to mix what I use. The benefit of fresh herbs is the flavor is more mellow. You can have more combinations together. I will say, unless you really know what you're doing, avoid using oils. So if you watch the Great British Baking Show, you'll find that they always are wary when someone's doing lavender, because lavender flavor in oil is a very strong, and it's easy to be heavy-handed in it. I will say using fresh lavender, very difficult to do. It's just not as strong. You can use a lot more fresh lavender than you could either dried or anything else. So it's just finding out what that balance is. Now, I'm not saying don't use oils if they're food safe and you know what you're doing, but build up and find out where you want to go with it, because they are just very strong. Now, one thing to consider, fresh herbs, it's kind of like in infused waters. They don't want to just freely release their flavor. They spend a lot of effort in making their flavor compounds. You're going to have to crush them, bruise them, cut them up finely for them to be able to release the flavor compounds that we're going to enjoy from them. It takes time. And you'll find there's a balance between, for most of when I'm making a herbal tea, I rely more heavily on chopping and slicing finely than I do using my hand to tear things up. Don't forget that your dried herbs have a shelf life at the same time. They're going to give you your best flavor within a year of harvest, and you'll find different ones last longer than others. But generally, especially if you're collecting your own herbs and you're processing, I wouldn't want to keep them much longer than a year due to food safety and just flavors situation. You greatly reduce your flavor. If you do dry your herbs, it's better to dry them whole and then break them up as you use it. As you break them up, I know you can fit a lot more in a container if you crush it, but that crushing, you release a little bit of your volatile compounds that contribute to flavor. So it's better to store herbs whole, or as whole as you can, and intact. So like with basil, I would store the leaves intact, and then I would crush it up as I'm using for an herbal tea. Because once it crushes up, you reduce your shelf life, and they're just going to release their flavor compounds into the air. Also, because no matter what, they are going to release a little bit into the air, you want an airtight container. So you're going to want to make certain that there's not airflow where they're just releasing flavor all the time. You're going to have a different flavor as expressed versus warm and chilled, and we discovered that as we were trialing. One of my favorite combinations is lemon, lavender, and mint, and it gives you a totally different flavor experience warm than it does chilled down. Sometimes the issue, though, is if you're chilling it down, you're giving it much more time for those flavors to steep. So that's also one thing to consider with it, and that's one reason sometimes you get a different flavor profile. So some food safety tips with herbal teas. Probably the number one is for an herbal tea, you want to use a full boil. That is much different than your teas made from Camellia sinensis. And often they have, you can see from this picture, different temperatures that you can use. Part is the drying down and processing of Camellia sinensis is naturally antimicrobial, so that there's not as much there to take off afterwards. Herbal teas, depending on what your herb is, the process of drying it down and curing it may not be antimicrobial. So turning around and using a full boil ensures that you cut back any microbes that might be there. And it's just because there's so many herbs you may be using, from a safety standpoint, using that boiling temperature might be best. May not be the best from flavor, but for safety, definitely do that. And in most cases, it is probably the best for flavor as well. Now, as you're processing your own herbs or storing your own herbs, make certain you don't let moisture into that container. It creates spoilage. It creates an issue where microbes can grow. Likely not, but they can. Mainly, you're just going to have some metabolism. You don't want your herbs to go rancid or anything like that as well. And that's more likely to happen if you have moisture introduced into the system. Also, there's different kind of statuses, and that's one reason I have this in here. You'll find that there's different ones that work together. And I really like this chart here that gives us kind of an idea of how flavors interact with one another. And you'll find that certain flavors are stronger than others, and you can use more of them or less of them to highlight different things as far as flavor goes, is when you're making your own herbal tea blends. If you're going to start consuming herbal teas in large amounts, check with your doctor and look over the medicines you're consuming. I would say that in most cases, herbs by themselves are not going to be strong enough for you to substitute medication for them, but they can interact with medications that you're taking. And if you start increasing certain herbs at large amounts, they could start interacting with medicines you need. So make certain that what you're taking is not going to interact with a very critical medicine. Now, there can be holistic good effects to herb consumption, but don't use it as a treatment plan for an illness you have. Use it as just a holistic approach to anything you might have. And always bring up, even though it's not an herb, grapefruit is probably the number one thing to consider with that. Grapefruit juice is a great thing to consume, but the compounds in grapefruit greatly interfere with a lot of medication out there. So that same principle can be there in some obscure herbs. None that I can think of off the top of my head. I think if you eat a lot of peppermint and a lot of lavender, it shouldn't interfere with any medication, but I'm not a medical doctor. Just make certain to run it through and make certain that it's not interfering with any of your other needs. And now we kind of just want to go through the process of making a few of these and show you some of the pictures I've taken with that. I told y'all earlier, one of my favorite compositions for a herbal tea was lavender mint and then with some lemon. And this makes for a lovely picture, but I'll tell you, I discovered that that is way too much lemon to put in, and you're going to overwhelm your other flavors there. And that's going to be the process learning through herbal teas. You'll figure out which balance you want with it. So I discovered very quickly lemon dominates, so I cut back lemon. Really, for herbal tea, you may only want 3 slices of lemons to make it have that nice base for you to go with and not overwhelm the other herbs. I will say an electric kettle is definitely the way to go. It makes it much easier to make herbal teas. For purpose of videos and demonstration, we got a glass kettle where you could see the distribution, and it has a nice area where you can put your herbs in the center, pour the hot water through that, and you have diffusion going through that mesh center. Earthenware pots are actually probably better for flavor profiles over time, and they hold the heat much better. So you could make it in a clay teapot, and it's going to still have the same effect with diffusion. If it's glazed on the inside, it's not going to interfere with flavor profiles, but it will hold your temperature better, and you get a longer steeping process. But for showing for audiences and picture purposes, I really like using a glass kettle. It's often nice, and you can see that diffusion going on. A very great thing to show for children too. Definitely bruise and chop your fresh herbs. So when I was taking these pictures, I just bruised the herbs, and I discovered through that process that I get a much stronger flavor release chopping. So in most cases now, I don't do this bruising process. I go through and mince them up to release and put in, and you get a much better flavor released into your herbal tea. I like using fresh herbs because the flavor combination is more mellow. If you're going to use dry, you're going to want to use much less, and they can often be competing with one another. Like I said, you're going to want to trial and find out which one works best for you long term in that goal. Definitely use the boiling water, especially for fresh herbal teas, and kind of compensates for anything you might have missed washing your herbs out in that process as well. Very important to use a high temperature when the herbs are not cured or dried, and depending on the process, even when they are cured or dried. Make certain to give your teas time to steep. You can see, because I didn't have anything that had a big color change, this is what it looked like at first. And you see it just kind of gave a mild yellow composition. To be honest with you, for demonstration purposes, I like to spike it with a little bit of purple basil, because purple basil doesn't change the flavor too terribly much. It does add a richness to it, but it also turns it a nice purple color. And people are much more satisfied with the demonstration when they get to watch a color change happen over the process of the presentation. For infused waters, probably the most common thing out there is cucumber mint. I like to add a little bit of lemon to it, finds that it highlights. And you can start with any pitcher you have at home. And it doesn't take a lot, and you base it off of the size of the pitcher. So we'll just go through the process. More than likely, for lemon, you want to go ahead and start with just adding that little bit of lemon juice. And then the nice thing about that is that will also, you'll dilute it down, and it will kind of, if you were going to use this for a demonstration purposes, there is a little bit of ascorbic acid in lemons, and that will mix with, it will prevent discoloration with your cucumbers and everything. You shouldn't be storing it long enough that discoloration is an issue, but it can reduce it. Thin slices for better flavor distribution for your cucumber water. And then fresh mint will release more flavor as it's shredded or sliced. You can go through and add your water. I will say different people have different water available. Your tap water may have a strong taste to it. And if that's the case, you might want to use bottled waters to have more of the flavor of the fruit out there. For a sustainability standpoint, I encourage people to use as much of your tap water because it's safe in most cases and you don't have any plastic waste. But if you do have a strong tap water and you're making this for a function, don't be afraid to go ahead and use bottled water to get the best flavor out of your fruit. You can let it sit at room temperature for an hour or several, chilled for best flavor. I'm a big proponent of letting it sit chilled, but you can let it sit out on the counter as well if that's the situation you're going to have for your event. So in this case, in a regular pitcher like this, you see all the fruit is wanting to float at the top. You may want to remove it prior to serving, just so that people are not having to worry about it. Some people won't mind getting a slice of cucumber in their water, and I don't mind it. But if you have a lot, kind of a line, a buffet setting, you may want to go ahead and remove the fruit or vegetable in there so that people can pour and not have to worry about the distribution of it afterwards. Watermelon basil is a nice, pleasant combination. Kind of reviewing what we've seen here, a lot of people are very prone to cut their watermelon in thick chunks. And I included both ways in this picture. You're actually going to get a much better flavor distribution in long, thin slices because you have more surface area for the fruit to diffuse in. And I jumped the gun and talked about it early, and that's essentially just what I was mentioning there. Sweet basil is probably the #1 thing you're going to want to use for these infused waters. There's a lot of different basils on the market. I'll say your holy basil, your Thai basils are great. Probably not for infused waters. I might save those for infused teas, herbal teas, because they have a much stronger flavor profile than sweet basil. And even sweet basil later in the season, if you let it get too big and it's flowering, you might have more of a licorice taste. So you do want to go ahead and taste it prior to putting it in. So this is a great picture that I found and I used for demonstration purposes. What I really like about these types of pictures is it kind of holds the fruit in place. This one actually, you can even remove the center afterwards, and it makes it much easier to remove the fruit. But it kind of holds it there. The fruit doesn't float all the way to the top because it's kind of in this situation. And you're going to get better flavor distribution if you don't mind taking the time to order a pitcher. Now, don't let barrier of ordering a pitcher prevent you from trying it, and if you want to try it, say today. But you're going to get much better results, I think, if you get a pitcher that is aimed for this in distribution. It also holds it at the right ratio because we went through and calculated how much fruit we were putting later. This pitcher is about a 3-quart pitcher, and it holds about 3 cups of fruit, a very good ratio of getting a good flavor distribution in there. If you want your flavor to have a bit stronger distribution, you might want to, especially with watermelon, go ahead and juice just a little bit of it so that you have a little bit at that level. But it doesn't take too much to make it a good flavor. You can see ultimately it's probably just about 1/4 cup of juiced watermelon in there, and that's enough to spike the sweetness enough to make it just a more flavorful experience for it. It also gives you great color at the start, which is the main reason I did it, so that I could have a nice picture for you right at the beginning. I will say once it's chilled overnight, don't be surprised to see this type of cloudiness because you're going to have more of the distribution of larger particles in there. You're going to reduce some of that once you take the fruit out, and some of this cloudiness is because of condensation there. But because of the distributions of sugars and other compounds, you're going to have some cloudiness. It's to be expected. And you're going to have a nice, stronger flavor profile letting it sit overnight with that cloudiness as well. Strawberry, blueberry, and basil is a great combination. I would probably only use it for fancy events, and the main reason is this. It's from fresh. Having to slice all the blueberries is a fairly labor-intensive process, and it's going to take you a while doing that. I will say from frozen is a great way to expedite it, but you're going to want to experiment with it on your own because frozen strawberries dominate. So you might actually cut back the amount of frozen strawberries you add by half and still maintain the same level of frozen blueberries to get the same flavor distribution out there. So there are many types of basil to experiment with. Your sweet basil, for this one, I actually used a lemon basil because it kind of added a nice, good flavor zest to it, and I really liked the combination that we ended up with there. Sliced or turned basil releases a lot more flavor you're not going to get a good bit of flavor if you just put whole leaf basil in there. You might get some, but not enough to justify it. So for recipes that call for a bunch of small fruit, this is where this picture is going to be very helpful. You can imagine with all those sliced blueberries that they would get everywhere in a pitcher. But when you have it in this type of situation, it's going to be held there. And I'll be honest, so for this pitcher, we added just a teaspoon of a blueberry simple syrup, blueberries cooked down to get immediate, it doesn't even give a lot of sweetness. It just gives a little bit more of intense flavor combo right off the bat. So if you don't have the time to let it sit, that might be something to do. And just to give you an idea, without a simple syrup, this is going to be what your starting color is. In the end, though, I find if you're going to let it sit in the refrigerator overnight, that little teaspoon of simple syrup did not change the flavor profile that much. We got about the same flavor even when we left it alone without that, and got the same color. But if you're pressed for time, those are just some tricks you can get to have your more full flavor quicker. Make sure to layer your fruit and mix together, especially in a pitcher like this. If you're going to consume it over time, you want to have an equal distribution. You don't want to have all your strawberries at the top and then as you're drinking down no longer have good strawberry flavor. So you're going to definitely see a color change long term over it. So even without starting from a simple syrup, you're going to find that you're going to have this color change overnight. It is definitely going to have a stronger flavor if you have it diffused overnight, and that's what I would recommend. They're especially refreshing being chilled overnight in that situation. And with that, but if there's any questions, I would be glad to take them now.